Hi everyone, my name is Angie Xiao. I'm a senior at Paul Lawrence Dunbar with the Math Science Technology Center program. And this is a video of my senior symposium presentation for my capstone research project. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and go ahead and we'll get started now. So as you can see on my screen, my project is all about the relationship of cognitive and psychosocial indicators to cocaine use variables. I had the pleasure of working on this under the mentorship of Dr. William Stoops at the Lab of Human and Behavioral Pharmacology at the University of Kentucky. So a little bit about how this presentation will go. I will first be going through an introduction, my purpose, then my methods, data, discussion, error, and future studies. I have a few acknowledgements to make. I'll show you my references, and then we'll finish off today's video by opening up the floor for questions. Alrighty, so obviously my project is about cocaine use, which has been a huge problem in the state of Kentucky and in the US as a whole for decades now. In fact, as you can see on my screen, from 1999 to 2015, the average rate of increase in cocaine-related deaths was 5.5%. Cocaine use disorder is associated with various cognitive and psychosocial variables. So what this means is that various psychosocial and cognitive differences can be observed as someone is using cocaine, especially to a severe degree. So what are these two things? Well, cognitive functioning is going to be all about someone's impulse control, inhibitory ability, execution ability, and working memory. Your psychosocial health is how well you fit into society, how well easily you can find that niche and conflict or lack thereof with family and friends, as well as your income. That being said, the purpose of this study then is to determine the relationship between cocaine use severity and frequency and a range of psychosocial and cognitive outcomes. We'll be finding various correlations throughout this study and hopefully be seeing ways that we can use these correlations in application for future treatment studies. So now we'll jump right into my methods. For better clarity, I've separated my methods into three distinct parts. Part 1, subject screening and competence. Part 2, cognitive functioning and psychosocial health measurement. And finally, part 3 is all about my data analysis. So a lot of people have asked me questions throughout the course of this study on how exactly it is that I find my subjects. Needing a lot of them, the biggest thing that actually gets done in my lab is the purchase of many advertisements in the radio, on social media, in magazines, and finally a snowballing procedure in which our previous participants spread the word to gain new participants. So if anybody is interested in participating in a particular study, the first thing they have to do is give us a call, in which they'll undergo a 20-minute phone screen where either myself or another research assistant is on the other end asking them various questions about their medical and mental health history. If they are able to qualify for an in-person screening, we'll schedule that, and the in-person screening usually lasts around 2 to 3 hours, in which we go way more in-depth into their history. And finally, if they can jump through all the hurdles at that stage, they're finally invited back for a consent appointment, in which they give their consent and are added into the study. After that, they come in for a baseline appointment where all the data relevant to this study is collected. A little bit note on competence: every single time we see a subject in person, we use a field sobriety test and a mental status test to ensure that they are in the right state of mind to give us the most accurate data, as a lot of this data is self-reported, and that participating in the study for the day will not cause them any safety issues. And this leads me to part 2, which is the bulk of my data collection. So the very first thing I have to do, obviously, is collect numbers for severity and frequency. So severity was measured by the number of cocaine use disorder criteria endorsed out of 11 on a survey by the DSM-5. So these criteria are things like recurrent substance use resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. If they said yes to something like this, that would be 1 point out of 11. A score of 7 or above is diagnosed as severe cocaine use disorder. Frequency was a point-blank question of how many days of cocaine use did you have out of the last 30. All of those values then are correlated against our cognitive and psychosocial health measures. So some cognitive measures that I used are the delayed drug discounting, which measures at what point a larger quantity of drugs is not worth the increasing wait for them. such as Do you want half a gram of cocaine now or 1 gram an hour in an hour from now? Along with this, I also measured impulsivity through the Barrett Impulsivity Scale Total Score, which is a 30-question test in which subjects rate their impulsiveness. Along with this, some more cognitive measures I used were the cued RT and the NBAC 1 and 2. The cued RT measures inhibitory control and response time, and the NBAC 1 and 2 measures working memory ability at 2 levels of complexity. On this next slide here, I have an illustration of both of those two. So you have a cued RT on the left and the the NBAC 1 and 2 on the left. Basically what the cued RT is based off of the orientation of a white rectangle. You can probably infer that it's going to turn green or that it's going to turn blue based off of the probabilities you see on the screen. However, if it turns green, regardless of its orientation, you have to hit a key on the keyboard. If it's blue, you have to inhibit a response. So obviously, as you can see, if you ever get that go cue or that horizontal rectangle, chances are you're going to have to hit a target. But if it turns blue, how well are you able to inhibit your response? So that's kind of what that measures, and the amount of times that they fail to inhibit a response is recorded. Along with this, regardless of the orientation, if the rectangle turns green, we measure the amount of milliseconds it takes before they actually hit the key on the keyboard. The NBAC 1 and 2 is a measure of working memory that shows every participant a series of letters. If the letter they see on the screen is the same as the letter they saw before or 2 slides before, then they have to hit a key on the keyboard as a target. So both of these tests provide really valuable information to me as somebody who is studying these kind of outcomes and have been clinically validated in previous studies. So in my psychosocial measures, I used 2 particular surveys. So the first is the patient-reported measurement information system and some select questions from that, which is their ability to execute or their quality of health in different situations on a scale of 1 through 5. Along with this, the Addiction Severity Index is a pretty comprehensive, actually, in-person interview we have that covers medical, employment and support, drug use, alcohol use, legal, family and social, and psychiatric statuses of a particular participant. Because it's one-on-one, we are actually able to get a lot of information, a lot of history, and a lot of stories from our participants that provides really meaningful background information when we go back and find correlations or try to draw conclusions from what we have, which is why I really like the Addiction Severity Index being a part of this study, because I think it shows that aspect of a participant that's usually not captured in biological or immune health measurements. And that moves me to my final part of my method section, which is all about data analysis. Coming out of the baseline appointment, I have hundreds of data points for every participant. And somehow what I need to do is condense all of that and summarize it into a more manageable number of variables. So what I've done is I've chosen 10 variables that I think cover the participant the most holistically. And these 10 that I chose were age, money spent on drugs in the past 30 days, inhibition failure, execution, NBAC 2 and 1 accuracy, money made from employment in the past 30 days, promise rate of 1 through 5, Barrett Impulsivity Scale Total Score, and finally, a delay discounting K-value, which summarizes the data from the delay discounting activity. All data was checked for accuracy, double entered by 2 different people, and any discrepancies between both entries I actually had to resolve myself. Data was analyzed using the statistical package for social sciences, and data was analyzed using Pearson bivariate correlations, in which significant correlations of a p-value of under 0.05 were flagged. And now we can finally move on to my data. But before I show you my correlations, I want to show you a little bit about my actual participants, so the descriptive data. I had 69 participants total who were disproportionately Black, disproportionately male, had an average age of 53 years old, and an average income from employment in the past 30 days of $480. And now for some correlations. So as you can see, I have 5 of my variables correlated against severity on my screen. I've highlighted my only significant correlation, which is money spent on drugs in the past 30 days with severity. As you can see, the second half of the variables also yield no significant values when correlated to severity. Then, when I correlated my first 5 values to frequency, I saw another correlation, which was once again money spent on drugs in the last 30 days correlated against frequency. And the same results for the second half of the variable shows that there were no significant correlations with frequency as well. So a little bit about my data. So obviously only one significant correlation was found between the indicators and the variables. However, I think it is worth noting that the variables significantly correlated with each other. Frequency and severity correlated with each other at an R value of 0.324 and a P value of 0.011. And while it is somewhat intuitive, obviously, that frequency and severity would correlate positively with each other, this is good information because it kind of testifies for the accuracy of the self-reported outcomes that we have, especially on frequency and severity, which is important because they're correlated with every other value, and they're kind of like the cornerstones of my data. Along with this, money spent on drugs was consistent across severity and frequency, which is a good thing, and which also means that it could serve as a proxy measure for these outcomes. The other variables may not have been captured in the indicators of frequency and severity, but that doesn't mean that though we can't draw conclusions from it, we can't take a look at the correlations that I did end up finding and see how that information can benefit us and lead and point us in correct directions for future studies. Data was extremely sensitive to each participant because I wanted to include this mainly because in my analysis at a certain point, I was missing severity data for 3 participants. And when they were included, my data of correlations changed drastically. So I thought that that was interesting because that really does show how maybe one bit of untrue information or one subject who doesn't necessarily report what they're reporting could heavily impact my final results. A little bit, so basically on potential error, obviously self-reported outcomes. Along with this is subjectivity of surveys that rely on a ranking system, which means that, you know, a 1 through 5 could mean something different for person 1 and person 2. Along with this, the measure of frequency, as many other things, were largely based on memory, and this is also possibly a non-standardized participant pool. Therefore, in future studies, I want to increase the sample size to reduce any bias that may be found in the numbers. Along with this, I'll be utilizing a timeline followback to replace my measures of frequency. And a timeline followback is basically a more visual way for somebody to recount the past 90 days in which they can really mark out what day of the week, you know, how that day reflects over the scope of a month. Which can often lead to more accurate data simply because they are consciously going through every day and marking whether or not they use drugs on that particular day. Along with this, I hope to group my subjects by demographic for future analysis to see how particular demographics might be differently impacted by cocaine use. And finally, the expansion of variable data included in the study will therefore allow me to go on a search for more significant correlations. Because the lack of significant correlations isn't necessarily a problem, but it is something I'd like to improve upon as I'm looking at ways that I can create more data, more significance, and therefore contribute to the existing database of knowledge in the scientific community. With that, I have a lot of people to thank for what you have just witnessed. And first and foremost, my mentor, Dr. William Stoops, along with the rest of the staff at the Lab of Human and Behavioral Pharmacology. I'd like to thank the Math Science Technology Center for making this possible by giving me time out of every school day. Along with this, the Kentucky Young Researchers Program for financing parts of this project. And of course, my family, friends, and teachers. Without them, this would not be possible. And here are my references. Feel free to pause the video here, take a look, or do some more research should you find that you want to. And finally, if you have any questions for me in particular, I'd be happy to start conversations with anyone because I am always very eager to talk to people about my project, and not being able to be there in person with you is really unfortunate, but I encourage you to send me any emails with questions or just suggestions about things that I could improve upon in terms of my studies, as I really do continue to look for ways I can improve my knowledge as well as my participation in the drug research community. With that, once again, thank you everybody for listening to my presentation.